Шановні колеги, я передаю слово доктору економічних наук професору Василю Отенка.
I would like to give a word to Professor Otenko.
Доброго дня. Шановні учасники конференції, розпочинаємо нашу роботу. Ми раді привітати всіх, хто долучився до 7-ї міжнародної конференції, присвяченій спадщині всесвітньо відомого економіста Саймона Кузнеця, Нобелівського лауреата з економіки 1971 року, чиє ім'я носить наш університет, Харківський національний економічний університет імені Семена Кузнеця.
Dear participants of the conference, we're starting our cooperation. We're happy to welcome all the participants of the 7th International Conference dedicated to the legacy of the world-known economist Simon Kuznets, Nobel Prize winner in economics in 1971, who our university, Simon Kuznets National Kharkiv University of Economics, is named after.
Сьогодні ми проводимо нашу конференцію у формі круглого столу під назвою «Неспокійний світ та перспективне майбутнього розвитку» та будемо з вами, з науковцями з різних країн світу, обговорювати суттєві проблеми за наступними напрямками. Економічний розвиток в умовах багатоаспектної невизначеності, тренди в освіті та нова парадигма розвитку університетів, домінанти соціального розвитку країни, сучасні дослідження, цифрове суспільство та інформаційні технології.
Today we're holding the conference in the format of a round-table discussion dedicated to a turbulent world and prospects for future development. And we're going to discuss substantial problems within the following areas. Economic development in the face of multidimensional uncertainty, trends in education and a new paradigm for university development, dominance of social developments of countries, the current research, and digital society and information technology.
Сьогодні нас чекають плідні дискусії, бо ці напрямки охоплюють практично всі аспекти цивілізаційного життя. В якості модераторів на пленарному засіданні з вами сьогодні працюють доктор економічних наук професор Василь Отенко і я, доктор економічних наук професор Олена Раєвна.
Fruitful discussions are awaiting us today because these directions cover the majority of topics and aspects of the civilized life nowadays. The moderators at the plenary session will be Professor Dr. Economic Sciences Vasil Otenko and Doctor of Economic Sciences Professor Olena Rayevna.
Слово для відкриття конференції надається ректору Харківського національного економічного університету імені Семена Кузнеця, члену-кореспонденту Національної академії педагогічних наук України Володимиру Пономаренко.
The word to open the conference is given to the rector of Kharkiv National University of Economics, corresponding member of the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences of Ukraine, Volodymyr Ponomarenko.
Дякую. Шановні колеги, учасники нашої конференції, перш за все, я хотів би вам подякувати. Подякувати за ті презентації, які ви підготували і відправили в оргкомітет, за ті статті, які будуть надруковані в журналах по ітогам нашої конференції. І я сподіваюся, що дискусії, які будуть розгорнуті на платформі цієї конференції, дозволять синтезувати нові знання, які будуть використовуватись на практиці.
I would like to welcome all the participants of this conference, and I would like to extend my gratitude for the presentations that you submitted for the participation in this conference and for the articles to be published afterwards. I hope that the discussions on the basis of this, on the platform of this conference, will lead to a synthesis of new knowledge to be later applied in practice.
Я підкреслюю якраз про практичну значимість результатів, тому що якраз Семен Кузнець, ім'я якого носить наш університет, якраз був знаменитий, ремаркабль у світі якраз за своїм використанням своїх наукових розробок на практиці. Він вмів будь-яку складну ситуацію розкласти на більш прості і використати в практичній роботі. Тому, да, будь ласка.
I would like to emphasize the practical value of this conference because Simon Kuznets, our university is named after, was particularly known in the whole world for his ability to decompose a complex problem into smaller parts and then to solve them and apply them in practice.
Да, сподіваюсь і впевнений, що ті дискусії, які будуть сьогодні, вони принесуть результати, і ми будемо працювати разом для розвитку економіки всієї нашої землі, світової економіки. І сподіваюсь на те, що ця наша конференція буде і далі існувати, і в наступному році можуть бути змінені там терміни проведення, але в будь-якому разі ми будемо раді бачити вас і в наступному році. А зараз я хотів би закінчити, побажати успіхів і плідної роботи, а більш розгорнуто у мене буде доповідь через декілька годин. Дякую.
I would like to say that I hope and I'm sure that these discussions will result in practical solutions that will, and we will be able to work together further to develop the world economy. This conference, I hope, will exist further, and next year we will be happy to welcome you, maybe on a different date, but we would be happy to welcome you at the conference, at the 8th annual conference, in order to discuss some more scientific issues. And now I would like to wish all the participants every success in their fruitful work, and I would return with some more information and with a report a bit later.
Дякуємо, Володимиру Степановичу. До нашої конференції надійшло відеопривітання від президента Національної академії педагогічних наук Василя Кременя. Увага на екран.
We have received a video with greetings from the President of the National Academy of Pedagogical Sciences of Ukraine, academician from the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. May we have your attention to the screen, please?
Шановний Володимир Степановичу, шановні учасники конференції, радий вітати від Національної академії педагогічних наук України, від себе особисто, всіх науковців з різних країн Європи, світу, українських вчених з такою значною подією, Міжнародною науковою конференцією, яка присвячена спадщині відомого вченого економіста, Нобелівського лауреата 1971 року Саймона Кузнеця. Цілком закономірно, що конференція проходить в стінах саме Харківського національного економічного університету, який носить ім'я лауреата Нобелівської премії і є одним із потужних університетів не тільки Сходу України, а взагалі України і достатньо широко відомим у Європі і в світі. Конференція силами закордонних та українських вчених сприяє актуалізації економічної спадщини Саймона Кузнеця та кожен рік ставить перед собою за мету глибоке науково-практичне розуміння та дослідження викликів та можливостей сьогодення, трендів розвитку національних економік, перспектив розвитку соціуму та глобальних тракторів розвитку цивілізації.
Dear Volodymyr Stepanovich, dear participants of the conference, on behalf of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, I would like to congratulate all the scientists on the opening of the international conference dedicated to the legacy of the world-renowned scientist and Nobel Prize laureate of 1971, Simon Kuznets. It is natural that this conference is held in the university named after him, which is one of the best established universities in Ukraine and in the world in general. The conference encourages actualization of Simon Kuznets' legacy, setting itself a goal of in-depth research and understanding of the modern challenges, as well as opportunities and trends in the development of national economies, as well as the society and civilization as a whole.
Нині ми зустрічаємося з вами у форматі круглого столу «Неспокійний світ та перспективи майбутнього розвитку», що за своєю проблематикою дискусій дійсно віддзеркалює проблеми сучасного часу. Специфічними особливостями цивілізаційного розвитку 21 століття є турбулентність перебігу економічних, соціальних процесів, виникнення феномену діджитал-суспільства та цифрової економіки, дифузія цифрових технологій у всі сфери життя і суспільства. Тригерами їх виникнення стала загальна політико-економічна нестабільність, обмеження та можливості, спричинені перебудовою конструкції, я маю на увазі структури та відношень у світових регіональних об'єднаннях, зокрема у Європейському Союзі, воєнна агресія Росії проти нашої країни і багато інших помітних подій. В цих умовах науковці різних країн мають згуртуватися заради розуміння, дослідження та вирішення проблем цивілізації, і міжнародні конференції стають ефективною платформою такого діалогу.
We're now meeting in the format of a roundtable discussion dedicated to the issues of a turbulent world and prospects for future development. It mirrors the current challenges the world faces. The specificity of the 21st century world is the turbulence of economic and social processes, emergence of the phenomenon of digital economy and digital society, and penetration of digital technologies into all spheres of human life, triggered by the overall political and economic instability, limitations as well as opportunities due to restructurations taking place in the EU military aggression against Ukraine. Under these conditions, scientists from different countries must consolidate their efforts for the aim of scrutinizing and solving problems of the civilization. Therefore, international conferences form the grounds for such a dialogue.
Я ретельно ознайомився з представленими на сайті конференції матеріалами і дійсно вражений проблематикою питань, яким присвячені доповіді. Вважаю, що сьогодні нас чекають дуже цікаві дискусії, які мають закласти основу спільних проєктів і досліджень, а це відповідає дійсно високому міжнародному рівню конференції. Конференція з року в рік стає більш змістовною, знаковою подією для української та міжнародної наукової спільноти. А проведення її саме у Харкові, фронтовому місті, у стінах одного з українських знаних університетів, який не переривав своєї діяльності ні за яких умов російської агресії, є символом незламної України.
Having studied the conference materials, I am deeply impressed by the scope of aspects to be discussed, and thus I am sure that the discussion today will lay the basis for joint research and projects which will stipulate the importance of this conference. Every year, the conference has gained importance for the Ukrainian as well as the international academic community. But this year, the fact that it is being held in Kharkiv, now the city in the front line of military action, at the renowned university, which has not interrupted its educational process under the war conditions, symbolizes the invincibility of Ukraine.
Особливу вдячність я хотів би висловити усім закордонним колегам, які своєю участю в конференції, своєю активною життєвою позицією підтримують Україну, розвиток української науки. Безумовно, хочу подякувати українським вченим, які у таких скрутних умовах стресової ситуації, військової агресії Росії знайшли у собі сили продовжувати освітню діяльність, наукові дослідження, розуміючи, що сьогоднішня ситуація тимчасова і Україну чекає світле майбутнє. Особливо моя подяка Володимиру Степановичу Пономаренко, ректору університету, завдяки зусиллям якого ця конференція стала можливою. Хотів би побажати успіху в проведенні конференції, а її учасникам від щирого серця побажати наукового натхнення, здоров'я, миру та злагоди у їх родинах, у їх країнах. Слава Україні!
I would like to express gratitude to our foreign colleagues who support Ukraine and the development of the Ukrainian science with their participation in the conference, as well as their active life stance. I would like to express my deep appreciation to the Ukrainian scientists who could rise to the challenge of war in order to continue educational and research activity with the understanding that the current situation is temporary and a bright future awaits Ukraine. I would like to express particular gratitude to Volodymyr Ponomarenko, who funneled all his energies into the organization of this conference. I would like to wish every success to all the participants. I wish scientific inspiration, good health, peace, and harmony in your families and your countries. Glory to Ukraine.
Дякуємо за виступ Василя Григоровича.
I would like to thank Vasily Gremin for his words.
Передаю слово Раєвнєвій Олені. Будь ласка, продовжуйте.
Дякую. Передаємо слова заступнику міністра освіти і науки України пану Андрію Вітренку. Будь ласка, шановний пане Андрій.
Пан Вітренко не вийшов на зв'язок.
Тоді переходимо до наступного питання. Перед тим, як розпочати нашу конференцію, ми хотіли би зупинитися на деяких організаційних моментах. Задля проведення дискусії питання до доповідачів можуть бути задані учасниками конференції, які присутні в аудиторії, шляхом підключення мікрофону. Учасниками конференції, які працюють в онлайні, шляхом реакція, піднята рука чи використання чату.
Before we begin with the reports at the conference, we would like to discuss some organizational issues. In order to support discussion, the questions can be posed in two ways. The first way is for the participants of the conference who are present in the conference room. They can ask a question after they switch on the microphone. The participants of the conference who work online can ask questions after they raise a hand in Zoom, or they can also use chat.
Шановні колеги, ми переходимо до виступів пленарного засідання. Я хотіла би передати слово представнику наукової спільноти Франції, почесному голові Школи економіки та Інституту передових досліджень у Тулузі, Нобелівському лауреату з економіки 2014 року, професору Жану Тіролю. Будь ласка, шановні колеги.
I would like to give a word, I would like to give the first word to the representative of the scientific community of France, honorary chairman for the foundation Jean-Jacques Lafont Toulouse Sciences Économiques, honorary chairman, executive committee, Institute for Advanced Science and Advanced Study in Toulouse, and the 2014 Nobel Prize laureate in economics.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to Simon Kuznets University. Let me first try to share my slides, just to make sure I can do that. We tried earlier, so that should be okay. So can you see the slides?
Yes?
Now, yes. Mhm.
Right, let me. Okay. So thanks so much for inviting me, and of course I cannot imagine what you have been going through in the last 15 months, but of course life must go on even in the worst circumstances. And I think this conference is a magnificent example where you look forward into the future, you invest into the future, despite the misery of the current state. In this period, I will be covering topic which is relatively unrelated to the current events, and has to do with the common good, and what we mean by the common good. So let me say a few words first. I wrote this book, Economics for the Common Good, about 7 years ago. And the reason I did that is that I felt the need actually to interact with a broader audience than just experts. So my whole life, I've been working with experts in company, experts in government, experts in central banks, in the competition authorities and the like. However, with the Nobel, of course, I felt an increased responsibility to actually address a wider audience, because in all our countries, a good democracy requires some people being knowledgeable about a number of topics, including economics. And we have seen that with the current trend, the creeping tendency toward populism, and that's something which is very worrisome. And therefore, it's very important that we share our knowledge, deciphering keys of the world we live in, so that it's not only available to experts, but it's available to a wider audience. And I also wanted to share my view of economics as a moral and philosophical science, because that's what I think it is. A talk about the common good must, of course, start with the definition of what is a common good. And it's very hard in a world where we all are different, are divided, to think about what the common good is. We have different positions in society. We have different lives, different countries, different religion or lack of religion, and so on and so forth. And something which I want to emphasize, that there are many situations in which the interests of citizens, of companies, of officials, the states, of countries diverge from general interests. So as citizens, we often emit too much carbon, we may refuse to be vaccinated, and of course then contaminate other people. We may overconsume antibiotics. We know of business or companies which take too much risk, or banks who are going to jeopardize the employment of their workers, the savings of their customers. They may abuse their market power. We see that the state may engage in excessive spending, may give a poor education, may tolerate too much inequality, may create financial crisis by not regulating well enough the banks. And countries, as you are well aware of, have a primacy of national interests over the interests of the world. My country first. And we see that in global warming, in trade wars, fiscal competition, and as you know, unfortunately, military conflicts. So what do those have in common? Well, simply the fact that the individual interest tends to trump the general interest. Okay, so that's a very important thing. So the ambition of economics of the common good is to align the actors concerned with the general interest. And to do so, you have two possible instruments. The first is persuasion. We want to encourage citizens and countries and firms to behave nicely. So we want to encourage good citizen behavior, corporate social responsibility, and the like. So we economists or sociologists will design what is called a norms-based intervention to boost the awareness of the consequences of selfishness or maybe the dangers of the prevailing social norm. But there are, of course, limits to what can be done by trying to change the norm. We have seen that with global warming. We have had over 30 years of exhortation since the Rio summit. And fundamentally, we haven't changed our behavior very much. So we need more than just trying to persuade. We need incentives to put the general interest back in the center. Now, I come back to the issue of defining the common good. As I told you, we're all different. We all have different views, different experiences. And, we have to think about how to reconcile those, at least to some extent. And the best we have at this stage is an old tradition, which is a tradition of the veil of ignorance. In theory, it's a very simple thought experiment. The question is, imagine that you are not born yet. So you're not born. You don't know whether you'll be Ukrainian, Russian, French, or Indian. You don't know whether you'll be born in a poor family or rich family, whether you'll be born a man or woman, with parents with instruction, or they didn't go to school, and so on and so forth. You don't know what your health will be. You could have the right genes, you may have the wrong ones, you may be subject to cancers and whatnot. So imagine that you don't know yet who you are, and you ask yourself, in what kind of society would I like to live in, right? So what kind of society would I like to live in? If I don't know whether I'll be a man or woman, what nationality, what religion, whatever. I mean, it's not a complete la-la land. So kind of society of abstraction in which people will just do good, and be nice. Just they will sacrifice themselves, because in the end, incentives matter. We all react to our incentives. Everybody. And we react to our incentive, and that's something to be understood. Of course, you also experienced that for a while, with the Soviet-style economies. And one of the first experiences with that was actually before Ukraine, what is now Russia, the Soviet Union, which with the myth of the new man. And it's not that they are the wrong person. It was that they just had the wrong framework. The idea that people will sacrifice themselves for the others, some kind of, we will be all be Stakhanovist, right? That in the end led to economic failure. It led to an authoritarian state, and also the deprivation of freedom, poor cultural life, and so on, and pollution, and all those things which are awful. So it started with a generous idea, and it ended up as being some kind of disaster. So we need to take into account incentive, but we have to ask this basic question: what kind of society would I like to live in? And you can get some implication out of that. The first is, of course, we want to have a good life, so we need economic efficiency. Of course, when you compare before the end of the Cold War, the West and the East, or you still see today with North Korea and South Korea, economic efficiency is tremendously important. So you need a strong legal framework, you need the right institutions, you need to fight abuses by monopolies, agreements to restrain trade, you can, you have good banking regulation, and could go on and on for hours, because that's really what we economists are doing, trying to understand how to reach economic efficiency. We also need to have a set of insurance mechanisms. So, for example, think about healthcare. Whether we are going to have a cancer or not is not our doing. It's just luck or misluck, lack of luck. And, in the end, if we had a private market, then the prices for those who will be tested in genetics could be very, very high if you have the wrong genes and you're going to be sick. So the market goes against solidarity, and behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing who we are going to be, we of course would like to have solidarity. Everybody should have a right to a good education. We have to correct all kinds of inequality, including gender inequality. I mean, this is kind of trivial, but to see how it comes from the scientific experiment, you don't know whether you'll be a man or woman, so roughly 50-50%. And, of course, you want to get an insurance. You don't want to be basically discriminated against, and so on and so forth. And that has to be done by the government. There are things which cannot quite be done by the government, which has to be done by us, so societal regulation. So basically, we have to be tolerant with respect to religious behavior or lack of religion, of course, ethnicity, political views, sexuality, and so on. We need tolerance, but government can help, but by and large, it's a matter of society itself. Now, once we have defined it, we have to think about whether we want a market economy. Now, almost every economy in the world now is a market economy, with lots of differences, of course. Some of them have still a lot of state intervention, and that's not always very successful. But we have to think about the markets. Lots of people are unhappy about markets. Even so, every country is a market economy. Our Weltanschauung, our worldview, is that market and incentive are key. Also, we as economists, like me, but many others, we have spent our entire research life basically examining market failure, examining failures of incentive, of high-powered incentives, and that's our life. But still, we try to make markets work better. So abuses of market power, antitrust, externalities like global warming, poor information, which give rise to financial regulation, consumer protection, poor insurance, which I mentioned earlier, and so on and so forth. By the way, inequality is a form of market failure. I mean, there's no reason for why the market will deliver the right amount of equality. But nonetheless, despite all this work, and there's of course a lot of incentive as well on why incentives don't always work. But there are still lines of attacks on markets, and there are two of them. The first is the market may frame our ethical choices. So the idea is that firms, the managers or the entrepreneurs, cares, of course, about money for themselves, but also to make sure that their firm is viable. But also they will also, ceteris paribus, they have social preferences and they would like to do good. The reasoning there in this criticism is that the markets, the managers, cannot express their social responsibility in the marketplace, because if they do so, then they will leave market share to their rivals. It's called in economics a replacement logic. So the reasoning is that if I don't do it, someone else will do it. So let me give you examples. Think about selling weapons to a dictator. Nobody likes doing that because, of course, the dictator is going to misuse the weapons. But still, lots of countries or firms do it because they say, oh, sure, I don't like to do it, but if I don't do it, someone else will do it anyway. Someone will sell the weapons to the dictator. Bribing officials. We all think that bribing officials is awful, and it is. But still a number of people bribe officials just because they say, look, it's not going to change anything. If I don't bribe the official, somebody will get a contract by bribing the official. Doctors in the US who are distributing a huge amount of opioids were saying, oh, I realize that I'm over-prescribing opioids, but if I didn't do that, then someone else, some other doctor will do it, and so on and so forth. Now, in a very recent working paper with Mathias de Watripon, who is at the Free University in Brussels, we say, yes, there's some truth to that, but only in well-defined circumstances. So this criticism of the market is correct, but only in very, very specified circumstances. And the reason for that is that it forgets another effect. So this effect is quite correct, but it forgets another effect. So the basic effect here is that if you have very strong competition, you will be losing market share if you behave in an ethical way. However, there is another effect, which is a competition is going to lower the markups. And by lowering the markups, it's going to make it less interesting to gain market share at the detriment of ethics. So if there is not much money to be made, you are not going to cut ethical corners in order to get market shares. In the end, we show that actually when prices are flexible, the ethical choices are independent of whether there's a lot of competition or very little competition, for example, a monopoly. And furthermore, when you have socially responsible consumer, all those are examples of socially irresponsible consumer, if you want. But if you have socially irresponsible consumer, competition is going to offer more choice, and therefore, competition is going to increase the ethical choices. So, in our view, this criticism of the market is not such a good criticism, except in very, very special circumstances. The second attack on economics is that there are a number of repugnant market, what is called a repugnant market. And the idea there is that, it's a criticism by civil society, religious leaders, politicians, and philosophers. In particular, philosophers, many famous philosophers have written on that with books which have roughly the same title. So, I just put two books. One is Michael Sandel, who is one of the star professors at Harvard in philosophy. And the other one is by Deborah Satz, who is a professor of philosophy at Stanford. Now, those two books have roughly the same title, but are somewhat different. So if you take Michael Sandel, he says that a wide range, and I'm reading here, of goods and services, including babies for adoption, surrogate motherhood, sexuality, drugs, military service, votes, and organs for transplantation, are not to be commoditized through markets, no more than friendship, admission to elite university, or Nobel Prizes are to be bought, or genes, or other life forms to be patented. So what should we make out of that? And my own view is that, for a number of those things, I kind of agree, but I don't like this view of taking a moral posture. And let me say what's wrong with this argument, what's wrong. I think of moral posture, what we feel when we feel revulsion, there are kind of warning signals. So there are something might be wrong with the market, but I think there are also very unreliable sources of ethical inspiration. So often moral assertions can override the freedom of others. So almost every religion have used in the past moral assertion to basically prohibit others from having a different religion or from having no religion at all. Same thing, the sexual majority has often said that the sexual minorities, like the gays, are immoral without giving any reason for that. And, it's really just overriding the freedom of others. That's the first argument against that. The second is that those markets exist whether we like them or not. Prostitution market, organ market, surrogate motherhood. So even if we don't like those markets, the issue is not to assume them away, they exist. The issue is to prevent them in the right way, regulate them. So my view is that what's wrong with market must build on the identification of market failure and the design of a proper regulation. And the point I want to make is that a number of those analyses of repugnant market have been done by economists actually before. Let me take, for example, externalities. Usually economists work a lot on externalities. So for example, to recommend a carbon price in order to fight climate change. That's an example among many examples. But in this, let me give an example which is less in the standard realm of economics. Why do we object to give babies to adoption to the highest bidder? So why would we object to an auction of babies to the highest bidder? One reason for that is very simple, is that there is a party to the contract which is not represented. That's the baby. There is no reason why the highest bidder should be the nicer person with the baby and will give the best education and the most love. And there are many other things which have to do with another form of externalities, which are image externalities. So if you are interested in reading that, I discuss that in my book, Economic for the Common Good. There are internalities. So internalities is basically an externality on oneself. So when we don't stand for the best of our interest. So for example, all of us have impulsive behavior, so myopic behavior. So we are impulsive and we overweigh the present over our future. So for example, we keep smoking when actually we would like to stop smoking. We take drugs, we undersave and so on. And that can also explain a number of things. So let me give you an example with organ sales. Organ sales, there might be a temptation to get money to sell an organ because we are poor, for example. And of course, in that process, we will be privileging the present of the future. And we have to protect people against their own impulsive behavior. Of course, that's not the only reason. And one of the reasons why we don't like things like prostitution, organ sales is it's also a signal that our societies are very unequal, because when you see someone selling a kidney for, say, $300, you wonder, it's really very little to sell a kidney, and that's really exploiting the poverty of people. Same thing, there are information issues. If I pay you to be my friend, of course, I will never know whether you're my friend. And there are lots of things. So if you go through the list which was given by Sandor, which was a list that I had before, you know of topics which were actually dealt with economists, including psychology-based topics. With my co-author, Roland Benabou, I've worked a lot on motivated beliefs, and we are not the only one. And they are very important. By the way, they are extremely important if you want to understand the recent trend toward populism and nationalism, which is, in my view, terrible, and is a very dangerous state of nature. If this is happening, we need to have open societies, open countries, and peace. But motivated belief, of course, it often goes in the direction of populism and other hills. So let me stop here. There's much more, I guess, but I realize I'm only 20 minutes, and I don't want to take all the time. If there is any question, I'll be happy to try to answer your questions. But I understand you have all conferences as well. So in any case, I would like to thank you so much for the invitation, and wish you a very, very good conference today.
Я б хотів побажати наснаги, і я хотів би подякувати за те, що в мене з'явилася можливість приймати участь у цій конференції.
Шановні колеги, чи є запитання до доповідача?
Dear colleagues, do you have any questions to the person speaking?
Could I ask a question?
Hello.
Oh, dear Mr. Terol, thank you very much for your speech. We really appreciate your participation and your support so much. I have a question. First of all, I'm Gavkalova Natalia, the head of Public Administration and Economic Policy Department, professor of the university. And I have a question. How can individuals and community effectively achieve the common good in an increasingly globalized and diverse world?
Well, thank you for this very good question. The globalized world can bring peace or war depending on how it's organized. There was this vision in the 18th century that it was called in French, actually, it was called du commerce. So gentle trade in a sense. So by trading with each other, we actually learn about each other, we meet each other, we learn how to trust each other. And that made it a war that also creates a stake in staying in peace. So you see now the formation of at least two blocks in the world, which I think will be a disaster. We don't want to go back to the Cold War. And commerce is putting some restraint on that. So, you know, this is actually very important. If there's trade, there's also something to be lost in terms of well-being and purchasing power. So there are attacks on globalization now, especially by the populists, by the way. They are very much against globalization. Some of those attacks are justified. So, for example, if you think about the opening of trade with China in the early 2000s, some regions of Europe and region of the Midwest in the US suffered a lot from the imports. Of course, there were jobs which were created, and that made not only China richer, but it made the US and Europe richer because we had access to cheap goods. But the people who lost their job in the Midwest of the US, of course, and were not protected, actually were upset, and we can understand them. And they started voting later on for Donald Trump, which is amazing and a disaster for our societies. And that's a more general lesson. So we need globalization. I don't think we are going to do without globalization because we want purchasing power. We also want peace. But we also have to make this globalization better by protecting those who lose from globalization. In the same way, we have to protect those who are going to lose from technological progress. Now with AI, artificial intelligence, you know, some number of people will lose their job. And we have to think about that because those people will be very unhappy and may actually vote for very unsavory candidates just by protest. You know, to protest against the system, they might vote for awful candidates. And, you know, that's something we need to consider.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Може, ще у кого? Так, колеги. Угу. Пані Лариса Гордієнка.
Так, дуже дякую. Хотіла би задати питання пану професору. Я Гордієнка Лариса, доцент кафедри публічного управління, державного управління публічного адміністрування та регіональної економіки, Харківський національний економічний університет. І у мене таке питання до пана. За якими критеріями визначають спільне благо? І чи ці критерії однакові на світовому рівні і на національному рівні? Дякую.
I would like to ask a question about the criteria to define this communal good. Are these criteria the same at the international and at the national levels, or are there any differences in these criteria for these two levels?
That's a good question. I will say, remember the definition of a common good. It's a sort of experiment. You don't know yet who you are going to be. So in particular, it means you don't know yet whether you'll be Chinese, Indian, American, Ukrainian, Russian, or French. So, we have to take it, in principle, you have to take into account the welfare of everyone in society. The issue, of course, with that is that this is a pure abstraction, but, in practice, of course, we have decentralized decision-making, so each country has its own government, has its own interest group and its own laws. And therefore, the political economy may not necessarily go in the direction of the common good. But what may help is multilateralism. And that's again a victim of the last 10 years, which is, the United Nations, for example, was founded after World War I. I mean, it was called the Society of Nations at the time, but, the idea of the United Nations was to create peace on earth, no more wars. The World War I had been awful, really awful, and just like any war, but on a wide scale, and people wanted peace. And there was this view at the time that by having a United Nations, we will prevent future wars. Of course, that didn't quite happen, but it may help if we want to solve the problems of our time. And wars is a prime, but there are many others. Of course, if you think about climate change, it's a very, very, very dangerous state of affairs, because our planet is going to burn. If we don't act very fast, the planet is going to burn, and we'll be in big trouble. Now, every country, many countries say, oh no, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to consume fossil fuel, oil and gas and coal and so on. And the thing is that it's a very, very dangerous thing. So lots of population will be displaced, lots of land. There will be lots of, you all know about that, lots of, climate disasters and lots of resentment. So new wars also because of that. So I'm very concerned, and we need to go back to multilateralism. And, this attitude of so many countries in the world saying, my country first, is not something that goes with the common good.
По-перше, ми маємо розуміти, що в основі цієї концепції лежить той факт, що ми маємо уявити, що ми, наприклад, ми ще не знаємо, ким ми будемо, коли ми народимося, якої національності чи якого гендеру ми будемо. І тому в основі кожного суспільства має лежати благополуччя та моральне та матеріальне благополуччя суспільства. Ми маємо розуміти, що це просто абстракція, і на практиці кожна країна має свій власний уряд, свої власні групи лобіювання, свої власні проблеми. І інколи цей уряд не йде в напрямку, не розвиває країну в напрямку суспільного блага. І, наприклад, ми можемо подумати про Організацію Об'єднаних Націй, яка була створена після закінчення Першої світової війни, яка мала катастрофічні наслідки для всього світу. Ця організація мала назву Суспільство націй, та в основі ідеї лежала ідея миру та відсутності війни. Бо люди хотіли миру, але цього не сталося, як ми знаємо. Тож, такі організації мають на меті вирішення якихось дуже важливих питань, які стоять наразі. І, наприклад, зараз ми маємо екологічне питання, екологічну проблему, і проблема глобального потепління – це дуже серйозна проблема, бо вона може призвести до того, що багато людей втратить своє житло, або багато людей втратить своє життя, і це буде мати катастрофічні наслідки для всього людства. Але все ж таки багато країн все ще не хочуть побачити цю проблему, і вони не хочуть зробити щось в напрямку вирішення цієї проблеми, тобто, стати більш глобальними з приводу вирішення цієї проблеми, і це може призвести до нових воєн. І ключем вирішення цієї проблеми може стати принцип multilateralism, як багатство думок, різноманіття думок і різноманіття точок зору.
Thank you very much.
Різноманіття підходів до вирішення проблеми.
Thank you very much.
Дякуємо. Я бачу, ще є запитання. Пані Власенко, будь ласка.
Hello. Good day, Monsieur Tirol. I have also a short question for your presentation. First of all, thank you so much for such interesting and detailed theme for us. So my question is for your slide number 5 about insurance mechanism in the frame of implications, the common goods. Can you give some example of implementing such insurance mechanism? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The insurance mechanism is basically try to make sure that for things especially for things you don't control yourself, you're actually not suffering discrimination. So, I mentioned the case of men and women. In the past and still today, there's a lot of discrimination against women, and still in a number of countries. And the men, of course, have some interest in that. At least some men have an interest in that. But the point is that if you try, so they might not give the same answer depending on whether you're a man or woman. But behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know yet whether you'll be a man or a woman, right? You just don't know. You are not born yet, and therefore you like to have some equality. I also mentioned the issue of education. So right now in many countries, education is very unequal. It has actually, the inequality has actually increased, if anything, in a number of countries. So if you are born in a well-off family, in a rich family with lots of education and so on, you get a magnificent education. If you are born in a rural area, in a poor family, you get a terrible education. And why should you get a poor education just because you happen to be born in the wrong, I'm not saying in the wrong family, but in a poor family, in a rural area and so on? There's no reason for that. So again, behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know where you'll be born from, in which family. And I mentioned the healthcare example, same thing. We want to have universal health insurance because people are not responsible for the fact, by and large, they are not responsible for the fact that they fall sick or or they're in good health. You know, it's something which is more or less independent of their will. So, you know, it's that kind of thing that already, once you get beyond the veil of ignorance, you basically have this demand for equality, for insurance, because, you know, it's a demand for equality in some sense. So that's very, very important to understand. And again, you know, if you're not behind the veil of ignorance, you cannot answer. If I'm in good health and I know I have the genes, I will live in good health, I'm going to be against universal coverage, because I will do better with private insurance. With private health insurance, I will pay a low rate, a low fee for actually, because people will know through genetics that I'm going to be in good health. So if I know if I'm in good health state, I'm going to be against universal coverage. It's only when you move behind the veil of ignorance that actually you become in favor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Шановні колеги, я бачу, що тут дійсно дуже плідна дискусія розгортається, і я хотіла би запропонувати наступну схему. Всі колеги, які мають ще питання до шановного пану Жану Тіролю, пишіть, будь ласка, в чат, і Жан Тіроль відповість вам в чаті також. А ми переходимо до наступного нашого keynote спікера. Пан Темко.
Dearest colleagues, I would like to make a small comment. Those questions that you still have to Mr. Tirol, you can ask them in the chat, and we hope that Jean Tirol will be happy to answer them in the chat, because we might be out of schedule. We have such an intense discussion now.
Слово для доповіді надається професору економіки Нью-Йоркського університету Абу-Дабі, члену Королівської Ірландської академії та члену Британської академії професору Кевіну Орурку. Будь ласка, шановний колега, підключайтесь.
We would like to give a word to Kevin O'Rourke, Professor of Economics at New York University of Abu Dhabi, member of the Royal Irish Academy, a fellow of the British Academy, and the former research director for CEPR. Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you very much. Can I share my screen? It looks like I maybe can. Okay.
Yeah, now you can. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Here we are. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, listen, thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great privilege, really, to be speaking at a conference in honor of Simon Kuznets in the city of Kharkiv. When I was thinking about what to talk about, I saw that the word uncertainty was used on the program, and I suppose that wars are the ultimate form of uncertainty. And I thought that it might be interesting to talk a little bit about what economic historians have had to say about what happens to economic growth after wars have ended. And I should say at the outset that I'm drawing on work by various colleagues around the place. This is not all my own research by any means. So I'd like to begin by saying something about Simon Kuznets himself. So he was clearly one of the founding fathers of modern quantitative economic history. And in particular, whenever you get an economic historian today looking at patterns of growth across countries, differences in growth rates between different countries, and seeking to draw lessons from that experience about the sources of growth, ultimately what they are doing is they're doing Kuznetsian economics, whether they are aware of this or not. And there's been a huge stream of literature that followed Kuznets, quantifying growth, measuring growth, pushing those measurements further back in the past, trying to figure out what drives growth rates, looking at patterns of growth across countries, looking for correlations with growth, and trying to draw lessons from all of this. So his intellectual accomplishments, for which he was obviously awarded the Nobel Prize, are well known, but I think it's also important to talk about his role sociologically within the profession, because he had a huge role mentoring students, advising students, and other young scholars. And that matters in economics, because as a practicing economist, you're inevitably very much influenced by the sort of work that your PhD supervisor did. So in my case, I mean, I was very influenced by the way that my supervisor taught me to do economic history, and he in turn was very influenced by his advisor, Mo Abramovitz. Now, Mo Abramovitz was not a student of Kuznets. He got his PhD at Columbia under a different supervisor, but afterwards he worked very closely with Kuznets on economic growth, and he told my own advisor, did Mo Abramovitz, that he regarded Kuznets as a sort of informal supervisor and maybe the most important economic advisor that he had. So that's a good example of how there's a sort of trickle-down effect of one person who's engaged and generous with his time, and he ends up having a huge effect on the profession, because, you know, Abramovitz and then Williamson and all of their students very much work in the Kuznetsian vein. So let me begin by saying just a little bit about wars in general and how they're treated by economists and economic historians. And the first thing to say is that they are very often ignored by economic historians. Sometimes that's quite difficult to understand. So if you think about, you know, the most central question in economic history, it's probably, why did Britain start growing rapidly and industrializing at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century? And if you know anything about history, you know that they were at that stage involved in what amounted to a world war with France, notably. And that fact is almost universally ignored by historians of the Industrial Revolution, which seems strange because it must surely have had an effect, these wars, one way or another. When you look at subsequent world wars, the wars of the 20th century, what you find is that in standard economic histories, these are almost blank spaces. So we write histories about the world between the wars, 1919 to 1939. We write histories of the world after 1945. But these wars in between are like blank spaces on a map. Maybe this ignorance and this neglect reflects an implicit assumption on the part of economists and economic historians that wars are not normal, that they're an exception to the rule, and that the rule is peace. Well, that, I mean, we all hope that this is true, but actually, if you look back at history, wars have been extremely normal at several points in history, to the extent that you could almost regard wars as being a normal part of the international system. And that led myself and a colleague, Ron Findlay, who sadly died a couple of years ago, when we were writing a history of world trade over the past 1,000 years, we found ourselves bumping into wars so often that we ended up having to talk as much about wars almost as we talked about peaceful trade. And so the word war made it into the subtitle of the book. So wars are, unfortunately, part of human experience, and we probably therefore shouldn't ignore them, but we should try to influence their causes and their economic consequences. So what have people had to say about the relationship between economics and war? As I say, not as much as you would like. There has been some work on the one hand about the impact of economics on who wins and who loses wars. And by and large, the conclusion of economic historians has been that, I mean, while wars are inherently random events, things can go right, things can go wrong on the battlefield. There can be moments of great brilliance. There can be moments of cowardice. There can be moments of great bravery that can determine what actually happens in warfare. Nonetheless, economic historians have been impressed by the extent to which warfare in the post-industrial world is largely an economic matter. And they have been impressed by the extent to which, for example, supplies of equipment from North America in particular to the Allies in Europe in World War I and World War II helped to shape what happened on the battlefield ultimately. And I think it's probably fair to say that my colleagues like Mark Harrison, who is at Warwick and who's a specialist on the economic history of warfare, they have tended to be therefore quite optimistic about the situation in Ukraine right now, because if you marry Ukrainian courage on the battlefield with Western supplies of arms, then you have reasons to hope, it seems to us, I think. And the blockade of Russia is surely going to be useful in helping to prevent them from prosecuting the war efficiently. So that's on the one hand, the impact of economics on the outcome of wars. But what I want to talk about today, looking forward to a period where hopefully the war has been won and Ukraine has been entirely liberated, is what is the impact of warfare on economies once peace has finally broken out. And here, the history of the 20th century is sort of ambiguous. There's a good outcome and there's a bad outcome. The bad outcome is basically what we observed after World War I. There are several things to say about this. The first thing to say about what happened after World War I, and this was good, was that it led to the expansion of democracy in many parts of Europe in particular. So one of the things that you can observe just casually is that when you have your population engaged in total warfare, with all of the suffering that that implies, what that will ultimately imply is that once peace has been won, life can't just go on as normal. That's a typical finding. You have to give the people what they have been crying out for. And so, you know, in 1918, what people were crying out for was largely the right to vote. They were also crying out for the right to organize in trade unions, because this is a Europe that is industrializing and so on. So you have a new industrial working class. So they want the right to vote. They want the right to organize. After 1945, we saw something rather similar. In that case, what people wanted and what they obtained was modern welfare states, modern health systems. So you all remember that Winston Churchill, although he was always regarded as a great war hero, lost the election after World War II, because what people wanted was a left-wing government that would bring in socialized medicine. So that's, I think that's all positive, you know, because if there's an underlying demand for change on the part of the people, then this provides an opportunity to give them what they want. Now, in the context of the interwar period, there was a problem, which was that after World War I, everybody wanted to go back to the way that things had been before World War I. When I say everyone here, I mean the politicians, the elites, the policymakers. And so they wanted, for example, to go back to a monetary system based on gold. And for reasons that I don't have time to go into, it turned out that this gold standard was incompatible with democracy. It imposed too many costs on ordinary workers. And so the thing ended up being a bit of a disaster. And when we tell the story of what happened during the 1930s, and when we tell the story about the Great Depression, we largely talk about the way in which the gold standard failed to work in this new world. So that's one lesson. When things fundamentally change after a world war, and things very often change fundamentally politically after big wars, institutions have to adapt to reflect the new reality. A second thing that happened after World War I is that there was many new independent states that grew up, including my own, Ireland. And again, there was nothing wrong with this. In fact, this was probably a very good thing because it reflected people's desires to be independent. But one of the implications of that in the 1920s and especially the 1930s was that along these, there were now many more frontiers within Europe. And once the world started becoming more protectionist, what this meant was that there were more frontiers across which these trade barriers could be built. And so a lot of trade was destroyed. For example, within the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, there had been a division of labor between various parts of the empire before 1914. Now everybody wanted their own industries, and there was a breakdown of economic relations within that part of Central and Eastern Europe. But the most damaging consequence of World War I probably was the way in which reparations were handled. Now, I'm, by the way, not at all suggesting that we shouldn't ask Russia to pay reparations. I'm sure that we should ask Russia to pay reparations. But what happened after World War I was that the reparations were enormous, and they were required. So Germany was required to pay reparations to France and Britain, and they needed that money so they could pay back their loans to America. That's the way it worked. And the only way that the Germans could afford to pay the money was by being lent money, by borrowing money from bankers in America. So bankers in America lent money to Germany, that paid the money to Britain and France, that paid the money back to America. And as long as the bankers kept on lending money, the circle worked and everything was okay. And there was recovery in the 1920s. But then there was the crash and the money stopped. And once the money stopped, the German authorities and other governments in similar circumstances found themselves having to pay money, but they didn't have the money to pay it with. At that stage, you get massive cutbacks in expenditure, you get austerity, you get unemployment. You also get bank crises because the money is being withdrawn from private banks, and bank crises are very damaging for all sorts of reasons. And that's really what happens in especially 1931 and 1932. And so you have the Democrats in a country like Germany saying, we must pay back the money, therefore we're going to have to raise your taxes and cut your pay. And eventually somebody's going to come along and say, you know what, I think we should just stop paying back the money. And we know who that person was. And this ended up being bad for everybody. So reparations were a crucial part of the disaster of the interwar period. This is just a graph that shows you what happens to GDP per head. So this is very Kuznetsian. It's showing you growth in different countries. So this is GDP in 1913 or 1939. This then is GDP after the World War. So in 1918 or in 1945. So obviously when you have wars, GDP falls because people stop producing things they're fighting, and you get factories being destroyed and capital being destroyed and so on. But then you recover. What you can see is that the recovery after World War I was very slow, very, very slow. What you can see is that after World War II, it went much more quickly. So the years after World War I were a disaster. The years after World War II were a great success. So why the difference? One obvious difference is reconstruction. On this graph here, what you can see is that income fell more during World War II than it did during World War I. And that makes sense because there was so much devastation across the continent as a whole. This is showing you what happened to GDP in various countries. So this is GDP in 1946 as a percentage of GDP in 1938. So if they're at 100%, that means that GDP has not changed. But what you can see is that especially in Germany, in France, in Italy, and Austria, in 1946, their GDP is, 50, 60% of what it had been before the war. So there's a huge decline in GDP. But when you have your income falling a lot, That, of course, means that you can have a lot of growth by just building again, by building back the factories and building back the schools and the homes and the hospitals and the infrastructure in general. And one thing that happened after World War II is that there was reconstruction, and it was incredibly quick. So what this table does, again, this is very Kuznetsian, it's growth in different countries. This is how far back in history did your GDP go as a result of World War II. So this is saying that in Austria, in 1945, their GDP went back all the way to 1886. So they lost, what's that, 60 years of growth in those 6 years. You know, you can see it was very severe in France. It was severe in Germany also. It was less severe in the UK because the UK was never invaded. There was bombing, but there wasn't warfare on their territory, which is what really does the damage. But then what you can see is that by 1951, Austria had regained all that it had lost. It was back to its 1939 level of GDP. And you can see that looking up and down this table, they basically recover their pre-war level of income very quickly. So in 5 years, 6 years, the reconstruction has already happened. So what you can look forward to after wars is a very rapid spurt of growth, just by virtue of rebuilding what has been destroyed. It's obviously important that that rebuilding happen efficiently, that public money is used effectively, and so on. But you would expect rapid recovery after a war. Now, in part, this was financed by Marshall Aid. And I suppose that when people think about growth after World War II, they very often think about Marshall Aid, which involved a lot of money. The Americans were very generous. And what we know is that there is a relationship between Marshall Aid and growth. So these are not very good regressions. These are correlations between growth and Marshall Aid. And these are not statistical exercises that will be publishable today. They're very basic ones, you know. This is from a paper from the early 1990s. But what it is saying is that there is a positive, this is a positive correlation between how much money you got, it's how much money did you get in Marshall Aid, and how quickly did you grow. And it's saying that the relationship is positive, and it's statistically significant. So, you know, some countries got more Marshall Aid, some countries got less Marshall Aid. My own country, Ireland, did not get very much Marshall Aid because we had been neutral in World War II, for example, you know, and we didn't grow as quickly as Germany or Britain that got lots of Marshall Aid. Okay, the puzzle is that although it was a lot of money, the growth was so enormous that the actual money that they got, it's very difficult to explain the growth with this money. If you think how much extra capital could they have bought or built with this money, how many more factories could they have built, or how many more imports could they have gotten with these dollars, and you then figure out what that would have done to growth, and then you compare that growth with what was actually achieved, you're only explaining a small percentage of the growth. So if you just look at the dollars, I mean, the dollars helped, but the dollars only explain a small share of growth. They maybe, you know, you can get up to 0.1% of extra growth as a result of this money. But we know from the statistical correlations that actually there was a big correlation there. So what's going on? And so what the economic historians who looked at this 30 years ago now ended up concluding was that it had a lot to do with the conditions that the Americans put on their aid. So what happened was every time the Americans gave you $1, it goes into a hat. And then you have to put an extra dollar of your own money into the same hat. So now there's $2 in the hat. And the way it works is you can only spend those $2 if the Americans say you can, okay? And the Americans are going to impose conditions on you. And if you don't meet those conditions, then you can't spend those $2. And so then what are these conditions? So, for example, this is a table of what they were asking the French to do. So in 1948, you can see that they were saying to the French, eliminate the budget deficit, you know, because one thing that went wrong after World War I, one thing that went wrong in the 1920s was that people were running big budget deficits, and then they were paying for these budget deficits in Hungary, in Germany, in Poland. They were paying for these budget deficits by printing money. And when you print money, you have inflation. And we know that there was a lot of inflation in the early 1920s. There was hyperinflation. So you can see the Americans are doing a lot of this, you know, stop running the budget deficit, pass the balanced budget, get rid of the budget deficit, get rid of the budget deficit. But they also at one point say, please build low-cost housing, you know? I mean, partly it's because they don't want the communists to increase their share of the vote, but partly it's because they're trying to promote social peace. And as I'll say in a moment, one of the things that helps explain post-war European growth is social peace between workers and bosses, between workers and capitalists. Another thing that the Americans say to the Europeans as a whole is, we will give you money, but you must then start integrating politically and economically. So we think of, in the Western Europe, we have forgotten this. We think of Western Europe as integrating because the French and the Germans decided that this would be a good idea. But actually what happened was the Americans said to everybody, you're going to do this now, you know? They didn't give the Marshall Aid to individual European countries. They gave the money to Europe, and they said to Europe, okay, Europe, you figure out how to spend this money. And so the European countries are forced to come together in Paris in a body that is now the OECD. So that's the origins of the OECD. It's this body that was set up in Paris, then the OEEC, to disperse Marshall Aid. So that's developing economic integration straight away, or political integration. And then they say, we want you to lower trade barriers within Europe. We want you to move towards some sort of a free trade area. And what you can see is that this works. This is looking at exports of these European countries to, you know, in general, and then to other European countries. So there's a big boom in trade within European countries. And it's ultimately from there that you get to the EEC, the European Union, and everything else. So Europe is in some senses an American creation. It's not something we like to think of, but that's actually how it was at the time. Because I mean, from the American point of view, they're fed up coming to Europe, fighting in world wars that start over here. They want us to get our act together. Okay. So now, whoops. So, oops, sorry. Okay, let me go back. Wow, damn it. Have I, sorry. Are you still with me, or are you?
Yeah, we're here, but unfortunately we cannot see your presentation anymore.
My screen went. Okay, here we are. Okay, back again. Sorry about that. I just got excited. I started pressing things.
That's good.
Yeah, okay. So Marshall Aid mattered, but it mattered because of this conditionality, largely. The Americans basically tried to prompt the Europeans to go down a path of sensible economic policy. And then you get the period from 1950 to 1973, which is a golden age of economic growth in Europe. Also, I should say, in communist Europe, growth was higher in these years than it would be after 1973, but it was especially strong in non-communist Europe. Why was growth so strong? What economic historians have argued is that this is partly because of this international trade, these international institutions, the European Economic Community, the European Free Trade Area, that promote trade within Europe, and also, of course, help to promote peace. So those are external international institutions that matter. Why do they matter? They matter because you're not going to invest in a big car plant if you can only sell in your own country, because all of our European countries are small by international standards. So to make those huge investments, you needed to be able to sell into a much bigger market, and that's what European integration gave you. So that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, you also had domestic political institutions based largely on consensual politics involving workers and management and government, and they basically got together and they went for pro-growth policies, because what you had to do then was you had to invest in new factories to produce these goods that had been already produced in America in the 1930s. Cars and refrigerators and vacuum cleaners and televisions and all of these new 20th century goods. So it was clear what you wanted to produce. The key was investing so that you could produce these things at scale. And so for that, you needed everybody to play the game. You needed the wealthy who make profits to not take those profits as income. You needed the wealthy to reinvest those profits to build new factories, to create more growth. So the wealthy had to play their part, but equally the workers had to initially restrain their wages, their wage demands, so that there could be the profits that could be reinvested to produce the growth. That was asking a lot of workers after World War II. But the government then steps in and helps make this political bargain work by, for example, giving workers a proper welfare state, giving them free education, giving them housing, giving them free health services. The workers then get to put, in some cases, representatives on boards of big companies to make sure that the rich aren't cheating and so on. So it was in countries like Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, especially, you had a very consensual politics. So it's partly about consensus building domestically, and it's about international institutions domestically. I'm running out of time, so let me just end with some implications for today, and you can better see if there are parallels with your own country situation than I can, and maybe parallels have been occurring themselves to you. But I mean, from the outside, it seems like, first of all, inshallah, there will be a period of reconstruction that will involve very rapid growth, and that will be good. And you will probably need financing for this, and hopefully you will get that, and that will be good too. But obviously, in the long run, it's long-run growth rates that really matter. And if you look forward to what Ukraine can hope for, and if you compare that with the positive story of post-1945 growth that I've been describing, it seems like several of the signals are positive. So if one of the things that spurred growth in Europe after 1945 was economic integration, European economic integration, well, this is, it seems, where Ukraine is headed. And you can see exactly what European economic integration can do for you economically if you look at, for example, Poland, and other former Soviet colonies in Eastern Europe. The EU membership is a machine for making you rich in the long run. Now, one thing that I've been emphasizing is that Marshall aid mattered because of the conditionality that the Americans imposed upon the Europeans. And a sensitive topic, I imagine, in the years after the war has been won, will be the conditionality that will be attached to EU membership. You don't just get to become a member, you have to align your rules and your institutions to European norms. And some people may see this as, something disagreeable. But I think if you look back at history, not just post-1945, but if you look at the history of countries like Estonia or Poland or other countries that have really made a success of EU membership, I mean, it's the conditionality that attaches to EU membership that makes it a machine for getting rich. And that's the point, is EU membership is not just about money from Brussels, it's not just about a big market, it's about becoming part of an integrated institutional framework that helps you become rich. And so, in my view, it would be a big mistake to seek to avoid that conditionality. If you do so, it won't be in your long run interest. You should embrace it. And my sense, again, from the outside, is that a lot of the reforms that would be required are reforms that ordinary Ukrainians are themselves seeking. And finally, this has been a total war for your country. And as I've said at the start, when you have total war, I mean, nothing is ever inevitable. But what I observe is that very often, once you have total war, you don't go back to the way that things were. People have suffered too much. People have done too much for their country, and ultimately then people will demand changes. But also maybe the experience can help to create the sort of political consensus in favor of European integration, in favor of growth, really, that will allow Ukraine to benefit fully from EU membership when eventually it does happen. So I would say, looking at it from the outside, and nothing is ever inevitable, it always depends on the decisions that people make, both ordinary people and the people in power. But looking at it from the outside, you would bet in favor of a very prosperous future for Ukraine once this terrible war has been won. Thank you very much.
Шановний пан Орурк, дякуємо за такий дуже обширний виступ, дуже цікавий.
Dear Mr. O'Rourke, we would like to thank you for such an outstanding report.
Шановні колеги, ми продовжуємо роботу. Я хотіла би нагадати про те, що всім учасникам конференції, які мають задавати питання і бажають задати питання до наших шановних доповідачів, будь ласка, використовуйте особистий час доповідача, бо в основному чаті у нас йде переклад основних моментів для української спільноти виступів наших шановних закордонних колег.
I would like to attract your attention to the fact that you can ask all the questions concerning the reports today in the private chat within this chat in Zoom, because in the main chat, the Ukrainian community, scientific community, can read the translation of the main facts and issues presented in the reports.
У нас много запитань до шановного пана Орурка. Будь ласка, пані Марина Мартиненко.
Thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Good afternoon, Professor O'Rourke. My name is Marina Martinenko. I am professor of Simon Kuznets, Kharkiv National University of Economics. And first of all, I would like to thank you for your report, for your interesting speech, and for your support of Ukraine, of course. And I would like to ask, please, can you recommend some analytical reviews, or maybe companies conducting such reviews that, in your opinion, most fully and honestly reflect the current situation of the impact of the war in Ukraine on the global economy? What of these reviews and information can be trusted? Because today we have a lot of different information, and I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's a good question to which I don't have an immediate wonderful response. I mean, the sorts of things that I would always trust, I think, the World Bank and the IMF, they have these world economic reports every year that I think are very trustworthy. And I would recommend then to Ukrainian economists who don't already look at it, there's for just academic work, and of course we can disagree amongst each other, so you don't always get a consensus. But I mean, there's this site Vox EU, which is associated with the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR. They have, very accessible digests of economic research, and they've had some stuff on Ukraine, for example, that some of you may be familiar with. So those German economists who were arguing that actually Germany could do without Russian gas, it would be able to survive perfectly well at a time when all of the captains of industry were saying, no, the world will disintegrate if we stop buying Russian gas. I mean, those guys got their message out on Vox EU, among other fora. So I think that's a very good resource, actually. Yeah. But I mean, for the global economy, I think the World Economic Outlook is nearly always very, very good, you know.
Thank you very much.
Шановний пан Андрій Котлік, будь ласка.
Thank you. My name is Andrei Kotlik. I'm Associate Professor of Management and Business Department of Simon Kuznets, Kharkiv National University of Economics. Thank you very much, dear Professor Rook, for your interesting, very exciting speech. And my question is, could you probably recommend a country or a group of countries whose track of post-war recovery should be learned and probably followed by Ukraine after the war ends?
Thanks, that's a very good question. I mean, after World War II, the outstanding successes are, I mean, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, especially. Britain does much less well, for example. My one hesitation, for jumping straight ahead and saying you should follow the German post-1945 model is that the world has changed since then, and in particular, the technological environment has changed. So back in 1950, let's say, it was clear what you should be producing. What you should be producing is the things that the Americans were already selling to their consumers in the 1930s. So cars and all of those technologies associated with electricity. So that problem was not a problem. You just had to copy what the Americans were doing. And so the big challenge was generating the investment funds to lead to factories being built and so on. And that's why these worker management cooperations were so useful. And it's also why European integration was so important, because you were never going to invest, as I said earlier, if you were just going to sell into a domestic market. I mean, now it's less obvious what you should be producing. We're at a stage where technology is changing very rapidly. So it's maybe more about trying to figure out what you should be producing. And there's no blueprint for that by definition. But what you can observe is that, I mean, for countries who are poorer and are trying to catch up with richer countries nowadays, the big name of the game is investment. It's getting investment from other countries. So it's maybe not as much generating your own investment, although that can always help. It's getting multinationals to invest in your country. That's true in Southeast Asia. They're trying to plug into what Richard Baldwin calls factory China. It's true in Eastern Europe as well. I mean, German multinationals are, as you probably know, investing hugely in Poland and elsewhere. And for that, you need stability. For that, you need stability, the rule of law, common institutions, common framework. And so I think that probably the best analogy for you would be a country like Poland, which is similarly sized and has been doing very well, and it's been doing very well by getting inward foreign investment associated with its membership of the EU. So if you're Vietnam, you have to sign investment treaties and so on, and you have to do it from scratch and figure out exactly what sorts of treaties you want to be writing with whom and so on. The advantage of being a European country like Ukraine is it's obvious what you should do. You should join the European Union, and you will have cost advantages. There'll be a great deal of goodwill. You've got an industrial tradition, and that's what I would go for.
Thank you very much.
Так, у нас ще також є питання. Будь ласка, Тетяна Сігаєва. Пані Тетяна Сігаєва, да?
Yes, hello, Professor. Your presentation was very, very interesting and very actual. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is, what the financial and economics impacts of the war for Ukraine in the near future?
In the near future,
Near future.
for whom? For Ukraine or for the rest
For
of it?
Ukraine, for Ukraine.
I mean, I find it hard to imagine that it's not going to be. I mean, if you have all of your men or many of your men fighting instead of producing things, that can't be good for GDP, I suppose. And I mean, if you have a war on your territory, that can't be good for inward investment. And if you have the Russians destroying things, that can't be good for your capital stock. So I can't see how the war itself is good for Ukraine. It's got to be bad for Ukrainian GDP. So I think, the economist, I mean, I think probably wants what every normal human being wants. It just wants Ukraine to win the war quickly, because the sooner you win it, the sooner you can start to recover.
Thank you. Thank you.
Дякуємо, шановні колеги, за ваше запитання. І ще є низка запитань. Будь ласка, задавайте їх у особистий чат пана Урурка, бо ми зараз переходимо до наступного нашого доповідача. Всім дякую. Пан Матенко?
До виступу запрошується ректор нашого університету, доктор економічних наук, заслужений діяч науки і техніки України, член-кореспондент Академії наук України Володимир Пономаренко.
I would like to give a word to Volodymyr Ponomarenko, Doctor of Economics, Professor, Honored Worker of Science and Technology of Ukraine, and a corresponding member of the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences of Ukraine.
Дякую. Перш ніж перейти до особливостей освітнього процесу в університетах, декілька слів про поточну ситуацію, особливо демографічну, в нашій країні. Прошу звернути увагу, що починаючи з 2014 року у нас є обвальне падіння населення в Україні. І особливо прошу звернути увагу по індексу, цілому індексу індексу, так би мовити, який характеризує соціально-економічний стан в країні, це народжуваність. І ось з 2014 року по поточний рік у нас впало з 500 тисяч народжених на рік до 190 тисяч. Отака ситуація страшна зараз у нас є. Що стосується іншої складової населення, це міграція. От, за даними нашої друга нашого Іви Йоганненсон, яка була у нас в Україні і доповідала свої результати. Ви бачите, майже 4 мільйони біженців зареєстровано в країнах ЄС, 4 мільйони тільки в ЄС. Із них 700 тисяч легально працюють і 450 тисяч дітей навчаються. Інакше кажучи, більше мільйона вже там прижилися і, мабуть, будуть залишатися жити. І що стосується суспільного блага, про яке казав месьє Тироль, я хотів би замітити, що доки в нашій Організації Об'єднаних Націй в Раду безпеки буде входити Росія як держава-агресор, про суспільне благо під керівництвом Організації Об'єднаних Націй казати, ну так би мовити, можна з великою натяжкою. Треба, мабуть, переформатовувати, як в свій час після Першої світової війни, і месьє Тироль про це казав, Ліга націй. Після Другої світової війни це у нас була Організація Об'єднаних Націй. Тепер іде війна, і, мабуть, треба переформатовувати якось цю організацію, інакше управляти тим чи іншим чином на світовому рівні буде неможливо. Ну, це, так би мовити, апропо. Далі, якщо ми приймемо до уваги те, що у нас була не тільки війна, яка йде, а і ще була пандемія, то майже 4 роки в Україні освітній процес здійснювався в таких умовах, що не може не вплинути на якість освіти в середніх школах. І фактично в доросле життя зі школи виходять діти, які з 8 по 11 клас мали обмежений доступ до освіти. Обмежений. Особливо це стосується дітей з малозабезпечених сімей, оскільки, так би мовити, вони менше мають можливості працювати індивідуально зі своїми дітьми, з репетиторами і таке інше. Суттєво знизився рівень вступників. Крім того, не всі ЗВО чи у нас університети не всі були готові у повній мірі до дистанційної форми навчання. Що стосується практичної складової навчального процесу в університетах, то вона катастрофічно послабилась. Більш того, знизилась ефективність роботи науковців, і не тільки в результаті втрати матеріальної бази, а і від нестабільного психологічного стану. Людина може творити, коли вона спокійна, а якщо на неї кожен день йдуть повітряні тривоги, коли вона змушена займатися, ховати своїх дітей, то про продуктивність наукової праці ми можемо говорити тільки умовно. Дуже послабились професійні стосунки з підприємствами і бізнесом в цілому. І не тільки у сенсі там наукових розробок, але це ж бази наших практик для курсових робіт і для дипломних робіт. Для того, щоб якось вийти з цього положення, ми маємо створити такі умови привабливі для того, щоб повернути наших людей не тільки в Україну, а особливо в регіони, прифронтові регіони. Мається на увазі такі, як Харківський регіон, Дніпровський регіон, Запорізький регіон. І для того треба декілька таких заходів, які буквально об'єктивно необхідні. Це, по-перше, це розробка і запровадження системи тимчасового житла, фінансування відновлення життєвого фонду, відновлення інфраструктури і освітньої, культурної, спортивної і системи охорони життя, і раціональна організація ринку праці. Дуже суттєво, це питання дуже серйозне, і ним треба займатися. І немало важливо також ще така умова – це треба переформатувати умови прийому до університетів. Треба створити такі мотивацію таку, щоб діти повернулись у ці регіони. Я маю на увазі знову такі прифронтові, це наші університети, це Харківська область, Сумська і так далі. Для того, щоб забезпечити всі ці критерії, ще не треба не забути про те, що треба організувати ще безпечні умови. А для того, от ми зараз обговорювали дуже серйозне питання, як організувати і створити небезпечні сховища для того, щоб коли повітряна тривога, щоб наші студенти і викладацький склад міг пойти і перечекати повітряні тривоги. Це також дуже серйозна річ, якою треба займатися. В результаті всіх цих речей у нас виникли дуже суттєві освітні розриви. Освітні розриви не тільки в середній школі, а й суттєві розриви і в вищій школі. Що стосується розривів в середній школі, без додаткового фінансування неможливо цього уникнути. Для того, щоб якось організувати цю підтримку, треба протестувати. Треба протестувати, які розриви, в якій сфері, математична, комп'ютерна чи мовно-лінгвістична, і розробити відповідні методики і контент додаткових дисциплін і організацію процесу ліквідації цих розривів. Що стосується системи усунення освітніх розривів при підготовці фахівців з вищою освітою, у нас є деякий досвід цього. Університети, ви знаєте, мабуть, а хто не знає, я вам скажу, на вході перший курс тестували і дивились, наскільки відстає наш вступник від тих вимог з математики, комп'ютерної техніки і з інших дисциплін, від вимог тих, які потрібні для того, щоб в повній мірі засвоювати навчальні дисципліни на рівні університету. І ми робили впродовж першого семестру додаткові курси для того, щоб це зробити. Але зараз це вже інша система, це інший рівень, і тут треба розробити нову систему, яка б дозволила забезпечити ліквідацію цих освітніх розривів. Що стосується адаптації ЗВО в період післявоєнний період. Дуже серйозно зростає роль якраз університетів, які мають тісні професійні стосунки з підприємствами та організаціями певної галузі. Це дає можливість готувати фахівців під конкретні робочі місця з визначеним колом не тільки soft skills, а і професійних компетентностей. Післявоєнний період потрібні буде не взагалі менеджери, а менеджери-економісти для конкретних галузей. Не взагалі інженери, а інженери під конкретні галузі. І це дуже серйозно, і це не просто так, це інші акценти. Акцент на мікрорівень, підготовка під конкретні робочі місця фахівців з вищою освітою. Для того, щоб це зробити, треба значно підвищити практичну складову і перебудувати навчальні процеси. Якщо казати про а для того, щоб це реалізувати де-факто і практично, треба перебудувати повністю нашу систему державного замовлення на фахівців з вищою освітою. Існуюча система формально студентоцентрована, але на практиці не забезпечує необхідну якість підготовки фахівців з вищою освітою, оскільки вона іноді дає державне замовлення таким університетам по тим чи іншим спеціальностям, які не в змозі підготувати якісно фахівців, тому що вони отримують державне замовлення на 1-2 фахівців і, відповідно, отримують фінансування на це. А це недостатньо навіть для того, щоб сплатити заробітну плату. Тільки університети, які показали свою спроможність підготовку по тим чи іншим спеціальностям, мають отримувати державне замовлення. Не буду перераховувати ті безумовні переваги спеціалізованих університетів, які дійсно є, тому що вони очевидні. Йдемо далі. Значить, що стосується мезо і макрорівня. Так, ідемо далі. Так, щось воно в мене зависло. Ага, так. Так от, якщо на рівні, на мікрорівні дійсно треба потужна спеціалізація підготовки фахівців під конкретні галузі, то на рівні, мезорівні і макрорівні тут треба віддавати більшу перевагу міждисциплінарному навчанню. І це для того, щоб забезпечити розвиток підйом економіки на регіональному рівні, і це ми бачимо. Для того, щоб це реалізувати, треба от таким чином робити. І як це зробити можна через мікрокредитна підготовка, яка здійснюється упродовж 4-6 кредитів. Після війни, зрозуміло, очікується значна зовнішня допомога у відбудові нашої економіки. Тому потреба фахівця зі знаннями міжнародного бізнесу суттєво зростає. Таких фахівців ЗВО мають готувати на основі академічної мобільності як студентів, так і викладачів. Ясна річ, що ті програми, які будуть зроблені для нашої країни, будуть вимагати і суттєву допомогу чи складову допомогу по соціальній відповідальності ЗВО. Це тут є велика і серйозна робота, яка має лягти на плечі наших університетів. Психологічна підтримка. Ми вже зараз бачимо, але після війни це буде мультипліцировано. Повернуться люди з армії, повернуться люди з еміграції, і вони будуть всі потребувати психологічну підтримку. Тому тут треба розпочинати, вже готуватися до цього. Які тренди зараз існують в світові тренди? Це цифровізація освіти. Ну, які тут можуть бути аргументи? Вони на поверхні. Це і використання штучного інтелекту, і будь-які онлайн-курси, підручники, дистанційне навчання і так далі. Гнучкість навчання, те, що ми використовуємо дуже серйозно через формування індивідуальної траєкторії навчання для кожного студента, це другий тренд. Зростання міжнародного співробітництва. Ну, куди без міжнародного співробітництва після війни? Це один із серйозних напрямів, які ми маємо піднімати і розвивати. І розвиток навчання упродовж життя. Перепідготовка, те, що я казав про мікрокредитні дисципліни. Перепідготовка, тому що треба адаптувати буде наше навчання під потреби ринку, і це дуже серйозно. Дуже серйозний напрям – це дійсно спрямованість на розвиток компетентностей не тільки софт-скілівських, про які я казав, а і про професійні компетентності. І тут ми маємо сказати, що треба результати навчання визначати не по тому, ми вже давно від цього відмовилися, але все ж таки, як оцінити результати навчання? Ну, тільки ж не через переказ конспектів, лекцій чи контент наших там підручників. Це мають бути портфоліо, які включають статті студентські, які були написані в підготовлені в період навчання, участь в проєктах науково-дослідних або проєктних роботах. Це, якщо це нормальні, то це курсові проєкти, це дипломні проєкти, інакше кажучи, результати. Отут має бути серйозний акцент. Отакі напрями коротко економлячи наш час, я хотів би перерахувати, і якщо є питання, то будь ласка.
Дякуємо, шановний Володимире Степановичу. Дякуємо за те, що ми вийшли з графіку, да, за умови таких сильних, цікавих доповідей. Да. Дякуємо, що ви зберегли наш час. Шановні колеги, будь ласка, чи є доповіді, питання до Володимира Степановича?
Mr. Panomarenko, thank you very much for such an outstanding report. We're a bit behind the schedule, so we thank you for making this quite concise. Yeah, and I would like to invite questions if there are any.
Я бачу пан Андрій Гордієв, будь ласка.
I see пан
У мене таке
Гордієв.
питання. Основна проблема практичної підготовки у закладах вищої освіти – це застаріла матеріально-технічна база. З іншого боку, виробничі фонди оновлюються кожні 5-10 років. Як, на вашу думку, в цих умовах можна забезпечити ЗВО доступ до сучасних технологій при обмеженому фінансуванні? Дякую.
Да, це дійсно така серйозна проблема, але тут ми маємо орієнтуватися на передові організації, на передові підприємства, на передовий бізнес і співпрацювати з ним на повну катушку, як кажуть. Якщо ми цього не будемо робити, то ми не зможемо зараз за короткий термін забезпечити такий вибухове підвищення матеріальної бази, лабораторної бази в університетах. А от залучення передового бізнесу до цього, це той вихід, який дозволить хоч якось зрушити це з мертвої точки. Оце так я хотів би вам відповісти.
Дякую.
Дякую. Шановний пан Олександр Пушкар.
Будь ласка, Володимир Степановичу, дякую вам за цікаву доповідь. А питання моє пов'язане з структурою підготовки університетів. От ви сказали, що серед тенденцій на мезорівні і макрорівні в повоєнний час на першому місці ви виділили фокус на міждисциплінарному навчанні. Ну і тут потрібні спеціалісти, здатні працювати в міждисциплінарних командах. А з іншого боку, стратегія розвитку вищої освіти в Україні на 2021-2031 роки розглядає як успішні інституційні архетипи вищої освіти майбутнього такі форми: нішевий дослідницький інститут, елітний загальноосвітній, масштабований цифровий університет та інститут професійного навчання. Отже, виникає таке питання: чи можна розглядати пропонований вами підхід до створення системи спеціалізованих університетів, які вбирають в себе окремі кращі властивості перерахованих інституційних архетипів вищої освіти, як новий інституційний архетип – спеціалізований або нішевий елітний цифровий університет професійного навчання? Дякую.
Так, я вам хочу сказати так. Коли я казав про спеціалізацію, то я мав на увазі не спеціалізацію університету в цілому, а приклад такий. Зараз у нас по машинобудуванню всі університети технічні готують таких фахівців. Але на практиці, через аналіз нашої бази ЄДЕБа, ми подивилися, що із всіх університетів технічних тільки 2-3 університети, ну, може, 4 університети набирають повністю академгрупи. Всі інші отримують по 2-3, набирають по 2-3 особи. От, і врешті-решт, яка тут якість підготовки? За рахунок цього ми втрачаємо, ми підрахували 2 мільярда гривень на рік на те, що готуємо оцих фахівців в тих університетах, які не в змозі підготувати. Не в змозі, тому що вони отримали всього 2-3 особи по державному замовленню, помножаємо на 70 тисяч гривень, це те, що держава платить за кожного фахівця, це не вистачає навіть на заробітну плату. Що стосується вашого питання, це також дуже важливо, і я б сказав так, на перший 10-15 років після війни це ключове має бути завдання якраз формування в існуючих уже університетах формування оцього кластеру спеціалізованих університетів на базі цифровізації і таке інше. Дякую.
Дякую вам за відповідь.
Шановна пані Людмила Потрошкова.
Дякую. Володимире Степановичу, дякую вам за доповідь, яка стосується майбутнього кожного з нас. В мене є запитання стосовно згаданого вами тренду дистанційного навчання, точніше онлайн-навчання. З одного боку, саме завдяки онлайн-навчанню багато студентів мають можливість продовжувати навчатися у скрутних життєвих умовах під час війни. З іншого боку, внаслідок, мабуть, саме онлайн-навчання, університет певним чином втрачає свою роль осередка розвитку особистості, місця для спілкування різних цікавих людей, спілкування між поколіннями і навіть втрачає деякі можливості психологічного впливу на студентів, про що ви вже казали. Так ось, будь ласка, яка ваша думка у повоєнні роки та у найближчі роки, яким має бути місце онлайн-навчання в університеті?
Тут дві сторони цього питання. Перше, університет є і буде обов'язково осередком чи центром культури в першу чергу. Потім науки, потім освіти, культури. Тому офлайн навчання має бути обов'язково. Але я вам хотів би сказати так, що не було б щастя, як нещастя помогло. Ви знаєте, зараз такий тренд, що лекційні заняття, те, що ми кажемо лекції, вони втрачають свою фундаментальну, так би мовити, основу. Чому? Тому що отримати інформацію зараз можна не тільки на лекціях, а і широкий доступ до неї ми маємо через Google, через штучний інтелект і таке інше. Тому акцент починається переміщуватись з лекційного матеріалу, який можна проводити дуже просто онлайн, на практичну складову, на дискусії, обговорення тих чи інших проблем і вирішення їх разом зі студентами. Ми маємо перейти на таку схему, що від начитання до дискусій, спілкування, дружнього спілкування разом зі студентами і вирішення цих всіх проблем. Тому офлайн обов'язково, тому що це все ж таки осередок культури, а з іншого боку переформатовуємо структуру навчального процесу, зменшуємо лекційні години і збільшуємо семінарські, практичне, лабораторне, для того, щоб спілкуватися, обговорювати проблеми з нашими рідними студентами, з тим, щоб формувати у них ту компетентність професійну, яку чекає ринок праці, особливо після воєнний період. Дякую.
Дуже дякую.
Дякуємо вам, Володимиру Степановичу. Ще раз учасники конференції нагадуємо, хто ще бажає задати питання до Володимира Степановича, будь ласка, використовуйте особистий чат. Пан Василятенко?
Запитань нема, так більше?
Так.
Переходимо далі. Переходимо до наступного доповідача. Пан Пол Сібрайт, доктор філософії, професор економіки Тулузької школи економіки.
We would like to give a word
Франція.
We would like to give a word to Paul Sebright, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of Economics at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me first?
Yes.
Yeah, perfectly well.
Excellent, thank you. Well, let me now share my screen. I'm having a problem with the screen sharing technology. Wait a second. It doesn't. It's not showing me which are my slides. Let me just quickly minimize all my other windows. I'm going to have to do this fast. I can't actually see my slides on my screen when I try to do this.
Ми можемо допомогти, якщо у пана Сібрета не відкривається презентація.
Can we be of any help to you?
Well, I hope so. I'm just, the thing is I clicked on the share screen button but it's not working. It's not, I'm going to try it again in a minute.
Не спрацьовує функція розширення.
Так. Пан Максим Лагутін, будь ласка, запустіть презентацію шановного доповідача.
Okay, let me just see. Okay, it's not, I can't tell which of my screens I have to share, unfortunately. This shows there's no, these are not the slides I need to use. I will very quickly just try and get rid of all my other screens, and there's a bug in the software. I'm afraid I don't know what has happened. When I try to share my screen, it just gives me a large number of blank pictures. Okay, I think this is probably the one. Let's see. Apparently I have to open my
Можливо, він перейшли нам свою нову презентацію.
Okay, I will.
Could you possibly send us your new presentation?
I think that's probably the best thing to do.
We could share it.
Yes, I will do this right now. And yeah, just a second. Who should I send it to?
Кому треба відправити?
Can you send your presentation to the chat, to the common chat?
Okay, yes. I don't know. I'm sorry, this is some.
Never mind, it's okay.
Okay, well, look, I can do it without slides. I can do it without slides if necessary, or I can send it by email. If you send me the, can somebody send me an email address in the chat?
В чат від...
Actually, in order to send the file to the chat, you need to close it first.
Okay.
Because of that, it's impossible to send to the chat, probably.
Right. Can somebody send me an email address? Good. Okay. Right. I've got this. I'll send the slides to the email address, and then I'll introduce the talk while somebody's putting the slides up. I apologize for this technical hitch.
Oh.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm just getting the I'm just attaching the slides as we go now. Right, the slides are attached and I'm sending the email. So let me start while we're waiting for these to come up. My apologies for this technical hitch. What I would like to deal with is something that relates to what Kevin talked about, which is an area of economic study that has been overlooked by economists for a very long time. Now, you in Ukraine are in an extraordinary situation. It's very humbling for me to be here. I'm very happy and honored to be invited to speak to this group of people. You are working under extraordinary conditions. And of course, the future of your country, as Kevin made clear, is one that is going to be shaped by extraordinary and unusual forces. Kevin has talked about reconstruction after war. I want to talk about something that economists for a very long time have neglected in importance, but which is coming to be important in the future of the world in general, and will, I think, be very important for the future of Ukraine. And this is excellent, thank you very much. This is the role of religion in world development. For a very long time, economists were rather embarrassed about religion. They thought of it as something that really didn't fit into the way we saw the world. And we ignored the fact that religious movements are economic actors. They command vast economic resources. They both invest and take from the rest of the economy, and they're able to motivate people to make costly actions on their own behalf and on behalf of their communities in a way that many other economic organizations like firms and businesses and governments and so on can only envy. So what I want to do in this talk, you'll see that I've given the first slide as an overview, is to answer the question about whether religion is in global decline, as many people claim, with an emphatic no. And the fact that religion is not in global decline is going to be important to the future of Ukraine. Now, what are the main ways in which I want to tackle that? First of all, to note that there's a reason why so many people based in North America and Western Europe claim that religion is in global decline, and that's because that's what it looks like from those parts of the world. Most of the data we have about religious membership, religious observance, the importance people attach to religion, do indeed show a decline in at least parts of Western Europe and in North America. But the situation looks very different from the rest of the world. And indeed, in North America and Western Europe, the temptation is not only to say what's happening to us is the future of the world in general, but also to connect it to the predictions that were made at the end of the 19th century by people like Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, that the modern world was somehow maladapted to a religious activity and that religious activity would gradually decline. Max Weber talked about the disenchantment of the world. Now, I actually think that Weber and others did not necessarily see religion as disappearing with economic growth, but they did see it as reforming. And what we've seen in the rest of the world is exactly that, that religion has reshaped and reformed, and in many parts of the world looks stronger than it has ever been. So I'm going to give you some statistics to show that, and I'm going to ask the question, where we do see a decline in religion, what's the explanation? And there are two answers to that. One is that many religious movements have adapted very slowly to the challenges of modern life, and that's particularly true in countries where they've held a kind of monopoly. But secondly, and very importantly, I think for your situation at the moment, is that religious movements have been instrumentalized by authoritarian political regimes. And where that has happened, we have seen a substantial delegitimation of those religious movements, because the evidence is overwhelming across the world that many people believe religion is important in their lives, but they do not like to see it instrumentalized for partisan political purposes by authoritarian political regimes. So what I want to do is to show you some evidence suggesting that overall religion is not in decline. Religious movements have adapted to the modern world. They do so by offering services that other institutions fail to provide. And what we're likely to see after the war is over, which we must all hope is as soon as possible, that the Russian Orthodox Church, which has been instrumentalized and has willingly allowed itself to be instrumentalized in support of the aggression that you have suffered, is likely to lose substantial legitimacy, whereas I think we're likely to see the Orthodox Church in Ukraine gaining legitimacy after the war is over. And we can ask important questions about whether it will use this legacy wisely. We can see in Poland, for example, where the Polish Catholic Church was substantially legitimated by the courageous role that the church played under communism. Increasingly in recent years, the Catholic Church has lent its support to partisan political forces. And there's a lot of reason to think, I think, that the huge gain in support that the Catholic Church enjoyed after the fall of communism may not last. So that's the overview. If I could move to the next slide, please. What I'd like to do is show you some of the sentiment that's been expressed, particularly in the United States and in Western Europe, about religion declining. So this is an article published in Foreign Affairs by Ronald Inglehart in 2020, so only less than 3 years ago, talking about the global decline of religion. The world is giving up on God, he said. If you could move to the next slide, the evidence has now come that US church membership has fallen below the majority for the first time. And so the proportion of Americans reporting that they no longer belong to a church is now over 50%, historically quite unprecedented. If we could move to the next slide, then what I'd like to do is to introduce the idea that we can use two kinds of evidence to see what's happening to religion at the world level. First, we can look at evidence mainly drawn from censuses, which allow us to see changes in the shares of the world religions since 1900. And what I want you to see is that although the data appear to show a big decline in the proportion of the world's population that identifies as Christian, this is a statistical illusion, and it's a very interesting statistical illusion. So if we could move to the next slide, what you see here is a series of charts demonstrating the division of the world's population by the major religious movements, beginning in 1900 and finishing in 2020. And the main takeaway message from this is that the figures in blue in the middle, which are the share of Christians in the world population, have fallen over just over a century from just under 35% to just over 32%. So it looks as though what the North Americans and the Western Europeans are saying is that, you know, Christianity is retreating. And actually you see here that there are more agnostics and atheists than ever before. No, sorry, there are many agnostics and atheists. There weren't any in 1900. And what you also see is a big increase in the share of Muslims from 12.4% to 24.2%. Now, it turns out that the picture given by this chart is almost entirely misleading. And I want to explain why. The first thing you might notice is that there were apparently no atheists or agnostics in 1900, but nobody thinks that's because they didn't exist. It's because nobody thought to ask about them. So the questions which have been put in censuses and other studies about atheists and agnostics have only begun to be asked since the second half of the 20th century. And what you actually see is that the largest proportion of atheists and agnostics in the world in the historical data actually came not today, but in 1970, where atheists and agnostics made up nearly 20% of the world population compared to not much more than 10% today. Now, of course, atheists and agnostics were not there because of Voltaire, they were there because of Stalin and Mao Zedong. And since then, there has been an increase in the importance of religion in some of the countries where Stalin and Mao Zedong were influential. But what you see is not a steady increase in the proportion of atheists and agnostics. It's actually holding fairly steady. You do see an increase in the proportion of Muslims, but the decline in the proportion of Christians is entirely misleading. And it's due to the fact that Christianity in 1900 was concentrated in parts of the world which were destined to grow very slowly over the next few decades. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see something that illustrates this very clearly, which is that in Asia, where many Muslims are concentrated, as many of you will know, only 20% of the world's Muslims are Arabs. 80% are non-Arabs, and many of those are in Asia, in countries like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia. What you see is that demographic growth in this region increased the share of Muslims in the world, but the share of Muslims grew in that region as well. The share of Christians grew as well, but it was very small to start with. It was 2.3%, and it rose to 8.1%, so it more than tripled by the beginning of the 21st century. But basically, very few of the world's babies were going to be born Christians anyway, because the demographics of the areas where Christianity was concentrated were just not favorable. If we move to the next slide, you'll see that this is even more true in Africa. In Africa, there's been an enormous increase in the share of Christians, which were around 9% in 1900 and had reached nearly 50% of the continent in 2020. But Africa was very small, demographically speaking, in the world in 1900. And so, although it's become important today, essentially Christianity spread in Africa in ways that we can discuss from a very small base. So could we move to the next slide, please? I now want to compare these kinds of data with data on religious commitment and the intensity. And here it's very hard to get figures from more than about 4 or 5 decades. You can ask in censuses what religion people belong to, but you can't ask serious questions about how important religion is in their lives. So the main source we have is the World Values Survey, which has been surveying people since the late 1970s and early 1980s. And what I want to show you is data about the proportion of people in a country who say that religion is very or somewhat important in their lives. Now, it's true that it's declined in some countries in recent decades. So I can give you examples: Ireland, Spain, Chile, the United States, although in the US it declined from a high level. But in a lot of other countries where it's low, it's been low for as long as surveys are available. So Japan and Korea, France, Germany, the UK, the proportion of people saying religion is very or somewhat important in their lives is 30, 40%, not more. But it's not declining further. It's holding steady at that low level. As many of you would know, in former communist countries, it has largely increased. And in particular, in countries with an Orthodox heritage, an Orthodox majority, it's actually more important than it was in the 80s and 1990s. In Muslim countries, it's extremely high. Not all of those data are reliable, but it's clear that in Muslim countries, people do say religion is very important in their lives. And it's true in Latin America and Asia and Africa for a huge range of countries with a very wide variety of types of societies. So Brazil, Colombia, Thailand, Indonesia, Myanmar, Philippines, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Zimbabwe. All across the world, people are saying, and I don't believe that social pressure or political pressure is forcing them to say this when they don't think it, at least not in most cases. People are saying religion is very or somewhat important in our lives, and they're prepared to back that judgment with economic investments, with donations of resources to religious movements. And so I think that economists and social scientists generally need to take that phenomenon seriously and need to think about what it means for social development, and in your case, what it's going to mean for the development of Ukraine in the future after the war is over. So could we move, please, to the next slide? These are the data. Unfortunately, the slide is a little, it's not very sharply defined on the screen, but what you see in this figure is a plot where I have taken for each country out of about 80 countries for which the data are available, the proportion of the population that says religion is somewhat or very important in their lives in the earliest year available before 2000. That is plotted on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, I've plotted the answer to the same question for the latest year for which data are available after 2000. So basically, any country who's on the 45-degree line, which is in the black line that I've drawn through the points, is going to be a country where the reported importance of religion did not change over about 40 years. Countries below the black line are countries where it declined. Countries above the black line are countries where it increased. And although it's a little difficult to read the country names, you can see some obvious ones. So USA and Canada are well below the black line. People said religion was much less important after 2000 than it was before. Ukraine is actually over on the left somewhere. It's difficult to read, but it's Ukraine is to the left, but well above the line. So the reported importance in Ukraine has substantially increased. And overall, there's no tendency for increase or decrease in the sample as a whole. Basically, there are as many points above the line as there are below the line. Now, you might think, is that true of all questions about religion? So maybe we could move to the next slide, please. The next slide asks about whether people believe in God. And what you actually see is that in many countries, in particular in the area of the former Soviet Union, what you see is a big increase from an initially low level in the proportion of people believing in God. So this is true in Ukraine, it's true in Russia, it's true in much of the former Soviet Union. And in the world as a whole, more people say they believe in God than say religion is important in their lives. And once again, there are basically as many points above the line as below. And this line, which is the 45-degree line, is statistically indistinguishable from a regression line through those points. Now, one area in which there has been a change, if we move to the next slide, is that there is a slight decrease in the proportion of the population who report attending services monthly. And interestingly, this is not just true in Christian countries, it's true in Muslim countries, it's true in many other countries, that people are going slightly less often to religious ceremonies and to religious observance than they used to. But they still say religion's important in their lives, and there's no evidence that their personal religiosity, as reflected in their belief in God and their personal religious practice, is declining. It seems that in some sense, there's been a bit of a move towards a more private form of religiosity with slightly less emphasis on attending services in public. We move to the next slide, please. So what I want to do is to summarize the story given by these data so far, and I apologize for having moved so quickly through what is a very complex statistical picture. But basically, the big story of religion in the last century and the current century is not some ideological struggle between retreating Christianity and expanding Islam, nor is it about a global decline in religiosity. It's a movement away from folk and local religions. We saw that in Africa, we've seen that in Asia. So animist and folk religions in Africa have declined. They've declined in Asia, they've declined in Latin America. And what we see is a growing corporatization of religious life. The more and more people belong to religious movements that are an outgrowth of the major world religions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism. Judaism, the numbers are very small, but the importance in the lives of the people who subscribe to them is very great. And so what we see is that this displacement, it's not total, it's not complete. There are many people in Africa, for example, who move from their villages where they basically belong to local or folk or animist religions. They move to the city, they maybe join a mosque, or they might join a Christian church. And when they go back home to the village, they'll still observe the traditional religious festivals. You'll see people in China or in Japan or in Korea may belong to a Christian church, or they may belong to a mosque, but at the same time, they will celebrate local religious festivals. So it's not mutually exclusive, But what's clear is that the global religious movements are shaping people's lives in a very major way. And the way they do this is by competing vigorously to meet the needs of people who are displaced by the circumstances of modern life. So people move from their villages where there are mutual support networks, and they move to the cities where they know nobody, and where the church welcomes them in, or the mosque welcomes them in, and plugs them into a network of contacts, which can be for anything between starting a business, getting a job, finding a marriage partner, making friends, taking part in leisure time activities, finding help raising their children, gaining spiritual advice, moral advice for their families. All these kinds of things are supplied by church, mosque, temple organizations to people in ways that the secular societies of modern economic life often find themselves very challenged to offer. And it's a big business. So there's an estimate that I've reported here of the revenues, just the financial revenues of US faith-based organizations suggest that these come to more than 2% of US personal income. And that, to give you a bit of a perspective, that means that it's more than the revenues of Microsoft and Apple combined in the same year. It's about 60% of the revenues of the whole entertainment and music and movie business in the United States. It's about 50% of the revenues of the whole restaurant sector. You know, this is big business, and this is only the financial revenues of faith-based organizations. It doesn't include the major investments of time and energy that people make and of donations in kind. And so the thought I want to leave you with is that because religion is so politically influential, is so economically influential, it becomes politically influential. And so all across the world, leaders who are who want to gain some of the legitimacy that they believe religious organizations allow have been becoming more religious even than they used to be. So if you could move to the next slide, you will recognize the picture on the right. You will recognize the picture on the left. These are leaders who have no particular history of personal piety, but who have decided that borrowing the authenticity of religious organizations is something that will do them good politically. The next slide, please, gives us Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, again, two individuals who in their earlier lives had no particular reputation for piety, have decided that this is good politics. Move again, please. Next slide. Benjamin Netanyahu, who was famously not personally pious. That is a picture taken on an election day in Israel. To the right, actually, Erdogan in Turkey is a little bit of an exception because he did have some reputation for personal piety, but he has played this up in a big way as part of his political campaign. And the final thing I want to show you is that this is not just a one-way relationship. Next slide, please. Many religious leaders have shamelessly lent their support to political leaders in this way. You're familiar with that in many other countries, but you might not have realized the extent to which it's happened in China. This is a video by one of the leaders of China's biggest online Buddhist movement. And in the video, the preacher is heard saying that Xi Jinping is the reincarnation of the Buddha. So, you know, obviously you can see why Xi Jinping, who appears to have no particular religious faith of his own, is quite keen to shower favors on Buddhist temples when he can get endorsements like this. I mean, this is worth many, many months of personal campaigning and touring around the countryside. I'm going to leave you there because what I want to suggest is, first of all, economists have been embarrassed about religion. They should not be. Religion is a major economic and social phenomenon which entirely repays our study. It's also important to understand that religion can be a force for good in society. It can be a force for great harm. We've seen the way in which religion has been instrumentalized by President Putin to try to garner support for his invasion of your country. My strong prediction is that that will cost the Russian Orthodox Church a great deal in future legitimacy. And of course, in Ukraine, the Orthodox Church has acted as a major rallying point for the people. When the war is over, people's willingness to trust the church will increase, and it will be a major and important question to see to what extent the Ukrainian Orthodox Church can remain a spokesman for the population as a whole, rather than, as has been happening in Poland, allowing itself to be seduced by partisan political movements. Thank you very much. And my apologies again for the technical problems at the beginning. I really have no idea what went wrong. It's the first time it's happened to me in a Zoom presentation.
Щиро дякуємо професору Полу Сіберту за таку ґрунтовну доповідь. Пані Світлана.
We would like to thank you for such an outstanding presentation, which told us very important things.
Шановні колеги, у кого є питання до шановного доповідача? Будь ласка, пані Олена Сущенко.
Good afternoon, everyone. Professor Paul, thank you for your informative research, very useful. And I have, actually, I had two questions, but you've already answered for the first one. I mean, in your opinion, should political leaders openly express their beliefs during their campaigns? But you've told that they should and they must. We in societies where they are extremely religious, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, what I've said is that they get short-term benefits from this. And the short-term can sometimes last a long time. You can see why it's tempting for them to do so. But I think the evidence from countries across the world is that eventually that leads to the delegitimation of the religious movements that lend them their support. So we've seen this in countries as varied as Iran, where now, although most of the population still feels it has to say religion is important because there's a lot of political pressure on them to do so, mosque attendance has been declining in Iran, and it's quite low by the standards of Muslim countries. And clearly, many people feel that the religious leaders who've lent their support to the political regime have become much less legitimate in the eyes of the population. We saw this for the Catholic Church under Franco in Spain, where once the Franco regime ended, the population of Spain, which remains personally in many ways and culturally very religious, many of them report believing in God, being observant of religious festivals and so on, but they do not want the church involved in running their lives. Something very similar was true in Ireland, where partly as a result of the scandals of abuse, physical and sexual abuse in the Catholic Church and in Catholic movements, Ireland has moved from being one of the most Catholic countries in the world to being one of the least Catholic countries in the world. And I think that where we saw the opposite movement, I mentioned Poland. In Poland, it was the fact that under the communist regime, the church was there for everybody. And you were, whether you were rich or poor, whether you were conservative, whether you were liberal, basically, if you were suffering under the regime, the church was courageously speaking out for you. And since the end of communism, the Catholic Church has progressively allowed itself to become seduced by the temptation of lending to support to very partisan political forces. So my view would be, if you're a politician taking the long view, you shouldn't do this. But most politicians, as we know, will not take the long view. And I think we can assume that after the end of the war in Ukraine, contrary to what will happen in Russia, the Orthodox Church will gain hugely in legitimacy, and politicians will vie to get the endorsement of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I strongly recommend the church's leaders not to give it to partisan forces, but to concentrate on building a vision of Ukrainian society, which is for everybody, including people who are not personally religious.
Thank you for your answer.
Наступне питання від пані Олени Сущенко, будь ласка.
Дякую, Олена Валентинівна. Professor Elena Sushenka, Professor Seabright, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation and your research. And I have a question according to the fact that religion is a big business, is there a reason for a state to exempt the church from paying taxes, even though many religious denominations have gone into competitive profit-making business on a large scale?
Excellent question. Excellent question. So my view is that many charitable organizations are exempted from paying taxes, and I understand why in many countries people would wish to treat religions as generously as they treat other charitable organizations. But there is a scandal, which is that in many countries, religions do not even have to do what most charitable organizations do, which is to publish accounts. Right now, for example, in the United States, if you're a charity and you wish to be exempted from paying taxes on your income, you have to abide by a number of transparency requirements, including the publishing of accounts, and you have to justify your charitable treatment. If you declare yourself a church, you don't. And it's true that the Internal Revenue Service occasionally investigates people who claim to be churches but are actually selling something else, and from time to time they bring a prosecution. But basically, if you claim to be a church in the United States, you don't have to give any idea of what your income is. You don't have to say anything about how you spend that income. And my preference would be that we should ask for religions, first of all, to religious movements of all kinds, first of all, to be subject to the same transparency and reporting requirements as charities are, and for then each country to decide whether religion should be treated the same way as other charities are, which may be not to pay tax, or it may be to pay tax. But I think that's something that countries can decide. But what I think is not really acceptable at the moment is that in many countries, religious movements don't even have to don't have to provide any information at all, don't have to publish any accounts.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Дякуємо, шановний професор Сібрайт. І, шановні всі учасники конференції, ми маємо зробити наступне зауваження. Зараз ми будемо з вами робити перерву, тобто ми перервемося в нашому пленарному засіданні, і об 13:05 розпочнуться роботи по секціях. Наш ще один дуже цікавий і дуже актуальний до сьогодення доповідь від доктора технічних наук, професору, завідувача кафедри кібербезпеки і інформаційних технологій ХНЕУ імені Семена Кузнеця, пані Ольги Старковій, буде перенесено на 4-ту секцію.
I would like to say that we will undergo several changes in the agenda of today's conference. We're now going to make a pause, and at 1:05 Ukrainian time, the work in sections will begin. The report by Olga Starkova, Doctor of Sciences of Technology and Professor, Head of Cybersecurity and Information Technology Department at Simon Kuznets Kharkiv National University of Economics, will be transferred to the 4th section because we consider that this report should still be discussed, and it must be paid enough attention.
Нагадуємо, що відповідно до реєстрації ви маєте зайти за певними посиланнями в Zoom-конференції відповідних секцій. У вас є можливість прийняти роботу практично у всіх секціях конференції, бо в відповідному листі було вам надіслано лінки конференції.
In order to access a particular section, you have a particular link which was sent to you in the email. You must use this link to enter the section that you were applying for as for your participation.
Ще раз нагадую, що ті учасники конференції, хто бажає послухати доповідь шановної Ольги Старкової, долучаються до 4-ї секції.
Once again, I would like to pay the particular attention to the fact that those colleagues who would like to listen to the report by Olga Starkova should join section number 4.
Дякуємо всім. Оголошується перерва.
Thank you very much. And now we have a break.